So I'm South African American. I always joke that I'm like Elon Musk, but broke. In 2023, the king decided that he wanted to run the project himself. They cancelled our business license, and 2 days later, they put out a statement that we had no official connection to the government, which technically was now correct. I mean, if anyone's been following what happened in Nepal lately, case in point, the biggest issue probably in the global south is corruption. But it's the idea that obviously these projects stand at risk of being expropriated. Dubai has a slight air pollution problem. They also have a really good control of the media, so no one really talks about it.
Thank you everyone for being here so much for the ARC Firesides on Network and City States. This is episode 5006 by now, it feels like at least. I'm very, very grateful to have Finch kind of with me. We only met in person for the first time this week, but I feel like we've had a load of conversations over a long period of time, and I'm really glad that we're getting to do this now kind of in person. I think, again, you've got a load of gems. You are not new to this space, right? You've been around for a little while. So why don't we go back to the beginning of art? Like, who are you? Where do you come from? And what are you doing?
Sure. So I'm South African American. I always joke that I'm like Elon Musk, but broke. And grew up in South Africa, went to the States. My mother's American. Did university in the States. Did quite well academically. Dropped out as per Peter Thiel's sort of preferred route and did some business. Did quite well with that as well. Went back about twice. And then I pivoted. I did different startups. I raised some capital. The main business that I did in the States was a distribution company. So very boring, very traditional, just normal like economic stuff, selling to like Walmart and Toys R Us and things like that.
Yep.
Then I sort of figured, okay, I didn't really think that the education system that I went through, the university model, and I was fortunate to go through a pretty good one. It was the top public ranked college at the time in the States that I went to. I didn't think it was really working very well for everyone. Neither was my sort of high school experience, which was also quite good. That was in South Africa. And I figured I need to like, how can we, redesign learning and living so that it's more integrated? So it's less of a siloed approach where you like live in one place and you learn in another place, and I don't know, you do other stuff in between. I thought, okay, how do we actually do this? Well, if you need a university as well, you need to have like a little college town. I came to the conclusion that you'd need to unlock the governance layer in order to do that, because you'd need to have custom regulation to actually enable this type of learning.
Sure.
That was one of the biggest obstacles. That, and obviously cultural momentum, right, of what people are used to and so on. So you kind of need a whole clean slate to do redesign, right, in some ways. Okay, that's what kind of brought me into the charter city, startup societies, what is now sort of more popularized by network state societies or network states model. I did a kind of analysis, and as I say, I'd done quite well financially at the time, but I wasn't really satisfied. I was like, what do I really want to do? And I decided I needed to find some country where I could try and implement this model. I did an analysis of countries. Bhutan was sort of at the top of the list for me. There were other like little countries as well, like Swaziland and some, Paraguay and different small places all around the world. I'd obviously never been to Bhutan or really heard of it. About 2 years later, I managed to get there. I was like the first independent person to attach to their first private university at the time. And I studied formally under that university for a year, because again, I was kind of coming from an academic background.
Sure.
That had done this weird business at the same time.
And what year is this that you were in Bhutan?
Bhutan, well, that was just before 2013, because I lobbied for a year, and then I was invited back by the first democratically elected prime minister of Bhutan.
I mean, just quickly about that. What you'd have to lobby to be able to attend the private university, or what?
It was already in the university. Okay, while I was in Bhutan for a year, I lobbied the government there. I met with all the ministers. It's such a tiny country that wasn't very difficult. And it was an interesting story. Like, who are you? Why are you able to kind of wander around? Everyone else is in like an organized tour group.
Yep.
So I was able to meet with them, and eventually what happened was that Bhutan was working on a project called the Education City Project at the time. That was sort of the pet project of that government. It was like 1,000 acres where they wanted to set up satellite campuses for leading universities. And it was really foresighted, because Bhutan's biggest problem now is they lose about 5 to 10% of their population every year in terms of brain drain going to Australian universities in particular. So the prime minister saw my project was about education. Okay, well, why don't you come in and for a year as my guest and see if you can help with this project?
Yep.
So that was what got me in there in a more formal channel. But all along, I was kind of pushing for this like new model of education. That was what got me into, again, the space. At that time, I also was based in Bhutan. I was traveling around, that region. So like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, and obviously India. Uh, and I sort of, had to deal with some of the government issues there in terms of the new government that came in. So when I came in, it was the first democratically elected government. It had just transitioned from an absolute monarchy. The king at that time, was his first time in power, and the previous king kind of decided, let's make it a democracy before my son takes over.
Right.
And then,
Have you got similar plans or?
okay. But no. But we pushed forward under that. That government was pushed out. The Education City project was shelved for about 5 years. And I basically, like, to shorten the story a bit or shorten this answer, spent another 10 years kind of trying to get the project going. So a really long time in Bhutan, but I was working remotely at the same time, doing other stuff like tech consulting for companies and so on, business development stuff. And the previous government that's now no longer in power, I was friends with the prime minister and some of the ministers. So I proposed, to them, let's do this project when you come in. And 2 years after they were in term, they sort of agreed. There was some due diligence that happened. We basically pushed forward the project then, which now is the Gillifie Mindfulness City project. We proposed that to them. We did the feasibility work. We got some investment from some investors that are probably around. And we pushed that forward. But in 2023, the king decided that he wanted to run the project himself. They cancelled our business license, and 2 days later, they put out a statement that we had no official connection to the government, which technically was now correct. It was pretty heartbreaking, obviously, but the good thing is that the project is moving forward. It does break the glass ceiling for the region. It does show that you can sort of carve out a special zone and try something new, open experimental space. And Bhutan's still moving forward with that. I think one of the things that they got wrong when they did that was we had a kind of quite a different approach, which is we were focused on the economic engine to start. We don't buy into the sort of neo model, which is like you can just invest millions, or in the case of Saudi Arabia, many, many billions, into some huge, tertiary infrastructure. Tertiary, you've got primary, secondary, and tertiary, right? Tertiary is your skyscrapers and your big, amazing stuff. You need some demand. I mean, Singapore, Dubai, they weren't just like empty lands that became cities. Dubai had the pearl industry. Singapore obviously had the shipping industry and a bunch of other stuff. They had an economic engine. And so we designed that for Bhutan specifically, and we lined up about $2 billion of letters of intent, non-binding letters of intent from industry, like agri-tech and industry in particular, for export. They had essentially a free trade access to India. And it's actually, India is very restrictive, so that's quite valuable. So it was kind of a little skeleton key for companies to come in that wanted to sell to India.
Yep.
And they lost all that. And I think that's really important, because I think that one of the things that these projects are missing is the economic engine.
Sure.
Like there's the cultural layer, there's the built world layer, of course. Like you guys have a fantastic cultural layer, but like Vikram was talking about business models. These are really important as well. You have to integrate them. And as he said, not everyone can do that. Most people are sort of one thing or another thing. But if you can integrate them, that's where I think you will actually get the synergy, because now your ARC, project has like major income to spare that's self-propagating. You're producing in the world of atoms and not just in the world of bits. And when those two sort of marry, that's something that hasn't quite happened yet. Like there's a lot of deep tech, they call it deep tech innovation. That's a very popular field for people to invest in. And that can be in things like manufacturing and agriculture and agri-tech, because those are the guys we were targeting. We were like, let's not just bring in normal agriculture, let's bring in something next level that would actually like shock this part of the world, because it would normally only deploy in the US or the West. One of the reasons that those companies will only deploy in those countries is because they're worried about their IP. And if you come into these countries, your IP could just kind of be copied or leaked. One of the places we're quite excited about is Argentina. One of their biggest historical problems is, particularly in pharmaceuticals, they're just like they're violating all their treaties. And they don't value IP. Actually, Balaji mentioned, I'm jumping everywhere, but Balaji mentioned in his talk, right, that it would be really interesting to run an experiment with no IP laws, no copyright laws.
Yes.
And so there is an argument for that. But on the other hand, if you want to first attract these companies to come out of the West, you've got to give them those IP guarantees. And the way you can probably do that is with being able to craft out your own legislation and give really strong guarantees and have a cohort that's aligned in terms of the values on that. So that's one of the obstacles to FDI. That's one of the biggest obstacles for the Global South that's probably non-obvious. So if you can solve the FDI problem, like the foreign direct investment problem, that problem is really important. It seems tangential, but it seems like a tangent, but it's actually really important to developing the network state, the sort of pop-up, moving it into something that actually can stay and be sustainable. Because now you have your capital goods, you can produce your construction materials, whatever. It's not really expensive. You don't have to just bring everything to this verdant land, because typically you are targeting verdant land. If you're targeting land where there's a bunch of people already, you definitely don't have a clean slate. You definitely have a pre-existing culture. You definitely have pre-existing built worlds, precedents, and a whole supply chain. And it's really complex. So there's a very few places in the world where you actually have something of a clean slate. In some ways, Bhutan was one. They were never colonized. And that means they don't to be very frank, they don't have something like a chip on their shoulder. So they're more open in some ways. And they also, it's a very tolerant culture in general, a very peaceful country. I mean, I could say,
why weren't they colonized?
Because they were smart, and they made a deal, and they made themselves look unimportant they made a deal with the British at the time, that was served the British's needs. Also, they were quite difficult, because this was the time where you really had to trek through the mountains and get up to so they would be quite difficult to colonize. The Gorses of Nepal were very famous as well in that regard, but they were actually, it backfired on them. They were so good at that, the British
So interesting. There's a bit of a geographical barrier that kind of helps possess.
Very interesting. Yeah. And always the geography plays a huge role in culture.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
I felt like I only really started taking geography as serious as I did in the sort of Ukraine-Russia war, where you started to realize just the position of every hedgerow, of every hill, all the stuff that really, really matters. And you start to then map that across it. Why is there a hedgerow there? Why is there a river there? Why is there a bridge there? Or why is there now a village around that bridge? Just all of the stuff it maps about, all of this stuff, bro. It's insane. I mean, there are so many things to dive into what you've just spoken about there. I mean, okay, I got asked that why Bhutan, because you ran that sort of again, you mentioned Paraguay, you mentioned Swaziland, some of these places that you sort of considered, but I think you mentioned why sort of Bhutan, right? But I think with whatever you feel comfortable with, I think it'd be really interesting, because there's a number of people in the room, and it's been referenced by a number of people today, that are having these negotiations with governments as well, right? And they're just beasts, right? They're a complete different animal, and I guess do you have any tips or insights of how you do that right, how you make sure that you don't end up being ejected at some point down the future when you've done a ton of work for them? What are your sort of learnings, I guess, from that process with kind of with Bhutan?
You want my ideas on that? So I'm just kidding. Yeah. So you do need to spend your time in the country. You don't want to just go into a country starry-eyed and sort of take things at faith. There's a very big company in the charter city space that did that not so long ago. They invested a lot of money in an African country in good faith, and then they found out the minister was just pretty much lying to them so that he could get a big share of that. And this is not unusual in the Global South, because you have this weird dynamic which you could probably frame as corporatism, and it's one of the issues, because the left tries to paint capitalism as the issue, but it's really corporatism. And what I would define that as is you have a situation where the big companies, or the companies that manage to become big, have a very strong incentive to go to the governments and say, hey, increase the regulations, make it much harder for others to come in and compete, especially startups. And they don't say it that way. They don't say it in those words. Because we can afford to hire an army of accountants and lawyers and everything that comply, and they can't. And so they create a moat, an artificial moat through bureaucracy. It's not an accident. It's not it's whatever bureaucratic. They're what can I do today to make people's lives difficult? There's a vested incentive for the government, and so then they get some payback for that from these corporate companies, and that's what I would call corporatism, which is really an antithesis to capitalism in a free market scenario, because free market would mean as little bureaucracy as possible. So I think one of the things you have to understand is that the conversation that most of the global South governments are having is a conversation that's more aligned with that corporatism, and they have that preconception. And so if you go in a little starry-eyed and sort of propose something that sounds really great, where you're going to bring a lot of capital, etc., they're kind of waiting for like what's in it for them and what do they really need to do, and that's what they're laser focused on, because they're used to getting something out of these, like, high player or power player conversations, and that's really their focus. And so you have to really set expectations up front. That's the way to do this. I mean, what we do now is if I'm like, if League of Free Cities, which is my organization that works with different projects around the world to try and incubate and help them position, and particularly to help them on the governance unlock. If we're advising, what we suggest is like, when you propose your MOU or whatever, you should make sure you send it up front. So an MOU would be a memorandum of understanding that you want to sign with the government to get them to agree to some basic process. It's not even necessarily binding, but it's at least something concrete that you can show, like, we have some mutual understanding, and maybe something you can show investors. So it's a great first step if you can achieve that. So when we advise them, we say, like, include an anti-corruption pillar. And in that, we would say something like, okay, so obviously every country, I mean, if anyone's been following what happened in Nepal lately, case in point, every country has of this kind has a big problem with corruption, and a big, like, the electorate is really fed up with corruption. They kind of measure it. They're like, if you do a little bit, okay, but because we know you have to do a little bit, so it's the biggest issue probably in the global South is corruption. If you put an anti-corruption pillar, which says something along the lines of, everyone we're working with, we will never bribe. We refuse to bribe. If you ask us to bribe, like to pay you a bribe, we're going to probably report you. You don't want to do that.
Yep.
But what we will do is we will bring in all the press we possibly can and highlight you and everyone else that gets involved politically. These are obviously people that have been elected, so major ministers, etc., and point out that they worked with us under an anti-corruption pillar basis, and they had zero corruption, which is pretty good for the electoral future. So that's something we propose as an angle. But there's a lot of little, like, things you can do. I'll leave it in case you have another question to follow up on that. But that's one point. But there's a lot of things you can do to try and mitigate the global South dynamic and get around it, I guess, in terms of trying to unlock a zone.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the League of Free Cities then? Like, what's this? What are you up to? Yeah.
Sure. So the League of Free Cities is inspired by the Hanseatic League of Northern Europe. It's a historical precedent. Basically, in Northern Europe, once upon a time, sometime after the Roman Empire, there were a bunch of countries like, Germany and so on. I say countries, no. There was a bunch of territory in Northern Europe that had cities, but no nation states at that time. These cities decided to start cooperating on trade in particular, but also defense of trade routes, because no one was doing that. And so that what they did is, like, these were shipping routes. Of course, they defended each other's trade routes, and they worked together, these free cities. And I call them free cities because they were autonomous cities that ran themselves as, like, much like, the cities of ancient Greece or something back in the day. That was really successful. They really generated a lot of wealth and prosperity in the region. In fact, I think they were the most productive economically for a period of time. And unfortunately, ironically, because they were so successful, some of the cities became like, what else can we do next? And they decided to start, invading the other free cities. And that was actually the genesis of some of the nation states that emerged in Northern Europe. So, there's something to be learned. But the point I'm making is that those cities initially collaborated, and that unlocked a period of massive prosperity. The League of Free Cities has the opportunity to position as a coordinating front, really, for these free cities. We call them free cities. You can call them startup societies. They're network states that have decided to actually take root somewhere physical, right, and actually put down roots and build some real infrastructure in a permanent location, or multiple. And they have a degree of autonomy where they can craft their own laws, decentralized governance, you could call it. And so we work with these types of projects to incubate them, help them get to the point where they're close to or able to actually unlock with the government, and then get them to network with each other. And so it's kind of like a meta network state. So the network state thesis is that you will reunite around one shared value, and you kind of, that's your community. You have at least one shared value. That's Balaji's original thesis. And maybe it's like veganism, but In the case of League of Free Cities, the one shared value is that each individual project should have as much autonomy as they can to kind of experiment and try new things without any other project interfering. So it's like their shared value is the autonomy of each project, and beyond that, we don't really get involved. We don't like get involved in their thesis. I mean, if they're religious, or if they are focused on economics, or if they're an export processing zone, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter to us. If they're a network state, if they're ARC, we just want them to collaborate, in particular on like defending each other, not physically with arms, but in terms of soft power and diplomacy, with their host countries. I think someone told me Noah Smith was talking about this, the economist. In
Yes.
yeah. And he was also talking about the Hanseatic League, but it's the idea that obviously these projects stand at risk of being expropriated, and they also stand at the risk of just their legislation being pushed down, or de facto not being able to do what they should do, like Prospera
Sure.
in Honduras. And if they can leverage a little bit of support from other countries where those particular projects have a good relationship with their host governments still, and if there's like 20 or 100 of these projects, they can put a lot of geopolitical pressure on the country's governments not to do these things. And so they can actually work together to protect each other from a diplomatic soft power front. And that would be really powerful. So that's the baseline of the League of Free Cities. There's another aspect, which is like funding related, but that's the baseline. We incubate the projects, and we want them to sort of get to the point where they can really collaborate together and protect each other and help each other and learn from each other. But ultimately, they're still completely independent. And just to be clear, they're not our projects at all. We're just helping other founders, and we're also trying to set up a fund that would invest in these projects at a very large scale.
That's super interesting. And but we haven't even talked, you're also building a new city project yourself, right? So do you want to dive into that one?
Sure. Well, I mean, everything that I learned in Bhutan, obviously, that was a very slow learning process. I was a bit younger, so and I wasn't able to solely work on the project for the entire period, but we built a lot of IP there, let's call it, or a lot of we have relationships, we have business capital, we have all sorts of things that we can deploy, and so it made sense to try and deploy them somewhere else. And we actually had an MOU with the Bangladeshi government, and they'd given us the red carpet. We'd fly around a helicopter. But this was under Sheikh Hasina. Sheikh Hasina is currently in exile, and the way the country looked at the time, it didn't seem very stable. So we sort of said, okay, we think Sri Lanka is the better option for now, and we moved. We decided. I say we. I mean, it was really my final decision, but we decided to go into Sri Lanka. And at that time, the previous government of Sri Lanka, because it changed at the end of last year, was pretty excited and pretty ready to move with us. I was invited to the president's event, and I was able to give a talk to sort of all the upper crust and explain our model, the Human Capital Summit in 2024. But at the end of the day, we kind of sensed that they might not win the next election, which they didn't. And we're still, happy to work with them or the current government. The current government has a slightly different focus. The original project was like a large area, maybe like 5,000 acres to start. So you want a lot of area because you want to be able to bring an economic engine, right? So you need a lot of area to do things like industry and agriculture, which, by the way, we only want to do the clean tech version because we want to be able to preserve the lifestyle appeal. So we don't want to pollute the land or anything like that. But so that's one of the reasons we work with very tech-enabled companies that have the ability to not pollute, etc., and do things in a better way. But in Sri Lanka, we're working to line up more what we call tenant companies, which are really just investors that are investing in specific business models. Typically, for now, the economic engine stuff, and of course, there's tons in Sri Lanka, whether it's in the agricultural side, like nutraceuticals, because Sri Lanka, Ceylon, used to be the big like spice basket that produced for the country and for the world under the British Empire for a while. They were colonized, and that does present challenges. Yes, we're working to build the economic engine there. We are currently in something of a holding mode with the government because you kind of need to wait for a really good opportunity window that has to do with the whole political dynamic at a given time. But we're optimistic that, not in 15 years, but in like 18 months, we should be able to get an unlock. And part of the reason we're optimistic and part of the reason we chose Sri Lanka is because they already have a de facto charter city, which is a Chinese-backed, Chinese-invested company. So not so it's different to where we're sitting.
This is the Colombo pork, or whatever.
Yeah, which has 0% taxes for 25 years, up to 25 years, etc. And so we figured we could sort of piggyback on that legislation, because there's definitely a situation in a new country where you go in and you propose anything that's going to give you a different tax regime or different privileges, and political opportunists will be like, see what this government's doing. It's terrible, and so it can create a whole controversy. And that did happen with the Colombo Port City project for about 10 years. So they already been through that. So we were able to piggyback on that and leverage that existing legislation. And instead of saying we want them to do a whole new legislation, we just get an amendment to that. So it's like a shortcut. But every country is different. I mean, we're also looking, we're looking at other countries, but that's a project that I'm actually trying to build myself, our team as well. It's a separate company from League of Free Cities, whereas League of Free Cities is broadly just working with a bunch of different founders on their projects.
Yeah. And again, but you're on the ground in Sri Lanka, right? That's like the sort of the main bet.
As I recommend we should be, because otherwise you just don't really understand the dynamic.
Yeah, completely. And I guess like when you're plotting that again, you see the window being 18 months away. I guess like, what are you, again, with all your experience, like what are you spending that 18 months doing while sort of waiting? Do you just like not do anything because you don't want to overinvest, because you don't know until you know, right? And so actually you don't want to take too many steps down sort of like a road, or are you just deepening a commitment to the place even in that uncertainty? What's the strategy over those 18 months?
No, we're trying a couple of different things that make sense as business models now, with the full expectation that we can actually apply zone ruling to those, like zone jurisdiction to those in the future. Particularly the new government, what they proposed, instead of having one central large location, they want us across the whole country in rural areas, not in the central area, which is by far the most developed. There's a big disproportionate development and capital area, and it's not unusual in these countries. They want us all around rural Sri Lanka, where we can have like small 50 to 100 acre zones and work with the sort of local villages on specific opportunities, that are, like you were talking about geography earlier, they're very much specific to those. I mean, some of them are things like gold mining. You can't do that everywhere because you need gold. So we're building that economic engine, but as I say, that's quite early. Right now, what we are tangibly doing, I mean, like we're putting in some more capital into that this month, is working on like an eco-resort type play, because Sri Lanka has a booming tourist market, positioned to be sort of the Bali of South Asia.
It's so much nicer than Bali. Just as like a side point.
To agree.
No, but it is. Like that is way more diverse. There's like so much more going on. But so you're doing some resort stuff as well, yeah?
Right. Well, so we're working on that, and we're also trying to follow this model of what one of our investors called biocentrism, but maybe I would call it like biophilics, which is you're trying to integrate more of sort of a nature approach. So like simple things that people take for granted, but maybe in the net they have a bigger impact than people realize. So for example, air pollution, most big cities like Dubai, I lived there for 3 years. Dubai has a slight air pollution problem. They also have really good control of the media, so no one really talks about it. But as a result of that, of course, there's a slap knocking off on everyone's IQ that lives there for a long period of time. This is research-based. But the problem is that the distribution of intelligence is logarithmic. So if you knock off a little bit of IQ points, you're actually knocking off a ton of your functional intelligence, like, high points. So like living in a city like that, there's some danger there. And this is what I was talking about earlier. If you build an economic engine, we also have the opportunity to build it right, where we're not actually building in that pollution that's going to destroy the lifestyle appeal.
Well, it's, again, the analogy to Balaji is so the analogy to Bali is so interesting, because development there has ruined it. Like it's just ruined it. And I think it didn't have to be that way. That development could have, lifted a population and helped them flourish. Instead, through corruption and through basically all of us tourists not giving a flying fuck, basically, about what's going on. Like it's just like. But do you think there would a way? Yeah, no. Do you think there is a way for someone like Sri Lanka to create what Bali could actually be, and to have that development like truly actually be a win-win for all the people that are there, without destroying the beautiful, nature that's there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you would need a really good set of statesmen to win control of the government that are quite visionary, like sort of what happened to the UAE, but with a different slant. And then you'd need to be in for the long haul, right? It would be like a 10-year to 15-year cultural reform almost. I think a big part of it, though, is actually kind of what you pointed out, is the way tourists are. And the good thing about tourists is like they are kind of like ready to be guilty at the drop of a hat, particularly the young generation. So you can guilt trip them into maybe doing the right thing. But they're also much more interested in their convenience, like if they can get away with it. And so, in Sri Lanka, it's a feedback loop. There's a feedback loop where, you know, I, I want to try and phrase this politely. Tourists that aren't really thinking are, overpaying tremendously. And you'd think like that's a generous thing to do, but then it actually creates like the wrong vibe completely. Where people now expect that, and then they're going to like enforce that on everyone, including the locals. And so like then the locals get excluded because they can no longer participate in the economy at all. And it's not just on real estate. And end up with some whole negative thing. And now like half the population that are a little bit better off really don't like the tourists. And now you have like a Spain dynamic.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, it's quite complicated and contributed, but yeah, I think there is a way to do it right, and where Sri Lanka could actually figure things out. And we are trying to help them do that, obviously. So like some of the people that we work with, some of our partners, local partners in Sri Lanka, are doing things like proposing a 10-year, digital nomad visa with no restrictions for Sri Lanka. And then you would have people that are in there for the longer haul automatically, right? So not just coming on a short-term tourist visa.
Yeah.
And so they would be more interested in like, okay, let's get this right, because we're going to be here for 5 to 10 years. And
so interesting. Imagine if you had like minimum stays, not, it's almost like Network School has as like 1 month, right? And it's not really a minimum stay, right? You just have to pay for a month, right? But you can imagine if you flip the visas where it's like, no, like it's like you have to commit to be here at least a year, as opposed to you only getting a year to be here, right? This is how that would even change the mental frame of stuff, right? And even simpler, even what you're saying, just, people just realizing that it's, there's the option to be there for 10 years, right? As opposed to having to plan from the beginning that it's not going to be home and that you're going to leave.
100%. And in Bhutan, as you may know, I'm sure, they had a very like clear-sighted, far-sighted, this again was the fourth king's idea, policy for tourism, where they had a sustainable development fee that was pretty high. It was like $200, $250. But if you've been to Nepal and you've seen the backpacker scene, let's call it, like it's kind of cool in a way, because people can come in and they can like live on $1 a day or whatever. But it's not so good in terms of impact on the country to have like 10,000 people in every street that are foreigners. And so in Bhutan they have a very like low number of people, high quality experience, or they did until they opened it up like completely to India under geopolitical pressure. But in terms of foreigners anyway, they kept that policy. And so there's definitely a precedent for that, like setting pretty restrictive stuff. And then why that works is typical human nature. This is an exclusive thing that's hard to get, and now everyone wants it. And so if you did set something like you have to commit for a year, it could actually work counterintuitively, because they're going to be like, okay, so I have to make this trade-off sacrifice and then I can get into Sri Lanka. It actually can work, because Bhutan positioned themselves at the top of like the tourist, for a long time with that policy. And so it can actually work. Yeah. So
that's so interesting. Well, what should people reach out to you for? Like, what are you most interested in hearing from people about?
Definitely interested in talking to folks that are looking at unlocking special zones that could become, centers of decentralized governance, where they can actually legislate and craft their own laws as they need for their specific business propositions, whatever. So people that actually want to go into global south countries but don't necessarily know how to talk to the government, and are willing to actually go and stay in those countries and learn, and want some advice, and it's free to help them in the beginning. And then also, I think that's the main one, is just founders in the space, because we're trying to, for the League of Free Cities, we want to line up like 50 of these cities. And, Patrick Friedman, like, who's someone I deeply admire, would probably like scoff a little bit, like 50. Okay. It's not easy to do that. It's really ambitious. But that's the goal. We want like 50 of these projects maybe to try and unlock. So we really want to talk to as many founders as possible that we can try and advise and help, that are seriously interested and committed in actually unlocking a zone where you can do what you really want to do and try something different. Like there should be different experiments. There should be like 100 different projects all around the world that are running completely different experiments. And then what really works, we can learn from and replicate. People will do that automatically, and you'll actually be demonstrating by example which if you've ever engaged with anybody in the world, you know that's the best way to teach someone. You don't tell them what to do, particularly if you have kids. You don't tell them what to do. They're not going to listen. They'll copy what you do. So you set an example in the backyard of these countries of like good policies. If you can do that, then those countries will automatically, the people of those countries will automatically put pressure on their governments to say, hey, these policies are really working. Let's do these at a wider level. And that, by the way, is the story, which I guess this drum's been banged, but like of Chinese development. That's kind of what happened with the IFC in Dubai, certainly in Singapore to a degree, but slightly different there. But typically you had special zones that showed what really worked. And there's still like tons of room for innovation and human flourishing. The models that we have now are, they're cookie cutter in many ways. And there's a lot of scope for integration in particular, I think, between different areas. If you have a wide enough playing field, and that playing field should include not just the cultural layer, not just the built world layer, or even both of those, but definitely the governance layer. You need all three. If you have the governance layer, then you can really try something completely different, especially if you can innovate on all three concurrently and together. And that really is about League of Free Cities. That's really about getting a lot of people to collaborate together that have different skill sets, different ideas, and some of the gold that can work together and actually make that happen.
So how do someone get in touch if they want to speak to you?
Our website. My son's here for another 2 weeks with the cowboy hat at the moment. So, happy to talk or just come up to me and say hi. Lofc.io, Lofc.io, leagueoffreecities.io. That's our website. You can put an inquiry in there if you want to get in touch. Yeah.
Cool. Well, look, thank you so much for coming and having a chat. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You're brilliant. Okay, guys, so moving on. What happens when you draw lines on pieces of land where people may not belong? Well, so government debt is probably one of the biggest asset classes in the world. You have to own your real estate. If you don't own your building, you're creating value for someone else. Am I a real estate company? Am I a hospitality company? Or am I a startup community? Or am I a venture capitalist? Interesting. Because these are 4 different businesses. Those who are good at this thing are not good at this thing. Because they're 2 completely different skill sets. If you don't own the real estate, don't go in there and put in $10 million to put plants and couches. I didn't know what business I was in.